Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten backroads of the Navajo Nation, places where light fades, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these vast reservations, canyons, and desert plains are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts, each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. The Navajo Tribal Police serve a territory of over 27,000 square miles, much of it remote and isolated. Their night shift often brings encounters that defy explanation, calls that leave even the most seasoned officers questioning what they witnessed. These are not tales of entertainment, but documented events from official police records. They represent the thin veil between the known world and something beyond our understanding. Now, let us begin with our first story. In late October of 2012, the high desert of the Navajo Nation existed in a state of quiet transformation. The oppressive heat of summer had finally relinquished its grip, yielding to crisp, cool nights that carried the scent of burning cedar and wood smoke from isolated hogans. The days remained warm, bathed in a pale, thin sunlight that seemed to illuminate every particle of red dust hanging in the air. But the evenings were a different world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the western mesas in hues of violet and bruised orange, the temperature would plummet, and a profound stillness would settle over the land, a silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. It was a time of transition, not just for the season, but for the people who called this vast, arid expanse home. It was a time when stories, old and new, seemed to carry farther on the wind. Officer Thomas B. Gay felt these changes in his bones. At 47, he had spent more than half his life patrolling these roads, first as a young man full of purpose, and now as a seasoned veteran who understood the rhythms of the land as intimately as the lines on his own hands. His shift began at 10 p.m., a ritual that had remained unchanged for over 2 decades. He would arrive at the substation in Chinle, a low-slung building of concrete and glass that seemed to absorb the surrounding landscape, its walls the color of pale sand. The air inside always smelled the same, a mixture of old coffee, stale air conditioning, and the faint electric tang of the police radios that hummed constantly on the dispatch desk. He would sign in, his name a familiar scrawl on the log sheet, exchange a few quiet words with the dispatcher on duty, and collect the keys to his patrol unit, a sturdy Ford Crown Victoria that had more miles on it than most cars saw in 3 lifetimes. This particular evening felt different. The sky was unnaturally clear, a velvet black pricked with so many stars they seemed to form a solid blanket of light. The moon, a few days shy of full, cast long, sharp shadows that lay across the ground like dark pools of water. There was an energy to the air, a subtle vibration that set the small hairs on Begay's arms on end. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unusual. A feeling that the night was holding its breath. He performed his pre-check on the patrol car with methodical precision, his hands moving with practiced ease over the tires, the engine block, the emergency light bars. Everything was as it should be. Yet, as he slid into the driver's seat, the worn vinyl cool beneath him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this shift would be anything but routine. He was a man grounded in reality, in facts and evidence. But he was also a son of the Dini, and he knew that some nights were simply different. The first hours of Begay's shift unfolded with a familiar, almost comforting monotony he had come to expect. His patrol area covered a vast swath of the eastern reservation, a patchwork of paved highways, winding dirt roads, and tracks that were little more than suggestions through the scrubland. His first call was a welfare check on an elderly woman who lived alone in a trailer home near the base of the Chusca Mountains. Her daughter in Albuquerque hadn't been able to reach her for 2 days and was worried. Big A found the woman, Margaret Yazzie, sitting peacefully in her rocking chair, listening to a Navajo language radio station. She had simply forgotten to pay her phone bill. Big A sat with her for 20 minutes, sharing a cup of weak tea before calling her daughter to relay the good news. It was a small, human moment that served as a reminder of the community he served. A web of connections stretched thin across the miles. Next came a report of cattle wandering onto Highway 191, a common and potentially dangerous occurrence. He found the herd, a dozen bony-looking Herefords, leisurely chewing their cud in the middle of the 2-lane blacktop. Using his patrol car's spotlight and a series of cautious nudges with the front bumper, he managed to coax them off the road and through a broken fence into a neighboring pasture. He radioed the owner, a gruff rancher who thanked him curtly before promising to fix the fence in the morning. As Big A drove away, he watched the rancher's porch light flicker on, a solitary point of warmth in the immense darkness. These were the tasks that defined his job. A blend of social work, animal control, and law enforcement, all performed under the vast, indifferent gaze of the stars. By midnight, the patrol car's cabin had grown cold. Big A turned the heater up a notch, the air blasting from the vents carrying the faint, sweet smell of antifreeze. He was driving south on Route 7, the road a black ribbon unspooling before him, flanked by the silhouettes of juniper and pinon pine. The radio was quiet, save for the occasional static-filled transmission from dispatch or another unit conducting a traffic stop miles away. He thought about his wife, asleep in their bed in Chinle, and about his 2 sons, one away at college in Flagstaff and the other working as a mechanic in Phoenix. He felt the familiar pang of distance, a constant ache for many who served the reservation. His life was here, in this patrol car, on these roads, but a part of him was always elsewhere with the family he saw too often in the harsh light of a computer screen or the fleeting glow of a smartphone. It was the price of the job, a trade-off he had accepted long ago. But on nights like this, the weight of it felt heavier than usual. At 12:47 a.m., the calm rhythm of the night was broken. The dispatcher's voice, usually a calm and professional monotone, carried a hint of something else, confusion, perhaps, or disbelief. It cut through the low hum of the car's engine, sharp and clear. Unit 14, dispatch. We have a report of unusual activity in the Canyon de Chelly area. Caller is Dr. Michael Reed, a geologist camped near Spider Rock. Reports hearing sounds. The dispatcher paused, and Big A could hear the rustle of papers in the background. Caller states he's hearing what sounds like chanting, possibly in the Navajo language, but the acoustics are unusual, requesting you respond and investigate. Big A felt a familiar prickle of interest. Dr. Reed was a known quantity in the area. A geologist from Flagstaff, he spent several months each year studying the ancient sandstone formations of the canyon. A quiet, unassuming man who was more comfortable with rocks than with people. He wasn't the type to make prank calls or to be easily spooked. Big A keyed the microphone, his voice steady. Dispatch, Unit 14, copy. I'm approximately 20 miles out. ETA 45 minutes. Any further description of the sounds? The dispatcher came back a moment later. Negative, Unit 14. Caller is agitated. Says the sound seems to be coming from multiple directions at once. He's waiting for you at his campsite. Acknowledging the transmission, Big A flipped on his emergency lights, not because he was in a hurry, but as a matter of procedure, and turned the car onto the road that led toward the canyon entrance. The drive was a journey into deeper silence. The pavement gave way to a graded dirt road, and the Crown Victoria S headlights struggled to pierce the oppressive darkness. The landscape grew more dramatic, the flat desert giving way to the steep, sculpted walls of the canyon. The temperature continued to drop, and Begay could see the first hint of frost forming on the edges of the windshield. Delicate, feathery patterns that glimmered in the dashboard lights. The air seemed to thin, to become clearer, and every sound, the crunch of the tires on gravel, the rattle of the chassis, the low thrum of the engine was magnified. He passed the turnoff for the Mummy Cave overlook, a place he knew well from countless patrols. In the daytime, it offered a stunning view of ancient cliff dwellings, but now it was just a black void, a hole in the immense wall of the night. He felt a sense of isolation that was both profound and familiar. Out here, you were truly alone, a tiny speck of life in a world that was ancient, wild, and utterly indifferent. Begay arrived at the designated camping area just after 1:30 a.m. The site was a small, flat clearing near the canyon rim, marked by a weathered wooden sign. A single tent was pitched there, and beside it stood a man in a heavy parka, his headlamp cutting a nervous beam of light through the darkness. This was Dr. Reed. Begay parked the patrol car, the engine ticking as it cooled, and stepped out into the cold night air. The silence was immediate and absolute, a heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. "Dr. Reed?" Begay called out, his voice sounding small and foreign in the stillness. The geologist nodded, his face pale and tense in the beam of his headlamp. "Officer Begay, thank you for coming. I know this sounds insane." Begay gestured toward the canyon rim, a sheer drop of hundreds of feet into blackness. "Why don't you walk me through it, Doctor?" As they walked, Reed explained his background, his voice a low, hurried whisper. He'd been studying the strata at the base of Spider Rock for 3 seasons. He knew the canyon, its sounds, its moods. He was a man of science, a believer in empirical evidence. What he had experienced an hour ago, he said, defied all of that. It started around 1 a.m., he explained, a faint sound at the edge of his hearing. He had initially dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps the distant howl of a coyote. But it grew steadily louder, more distinct. It was, he was certain, the sound of human voices. They were speaking, or rather, chanting in what he believed was the Navajo language, though he couldn't be sure. They reached the edge of the canyon, the ground falling away into a void so deep it seemed to swallow the light from their flashlights. Begay swept his powerful maglite across the scene, the beam catching the sheer sandstone walls, the gnarled junipers clinging to the cliff faces, and the monolithic shape of Spider Rock itself. A towering sandstone spire that rose from the canyon floor like a petrified finger pointing at the sky. "The acoustics here can be strange," Begay said, his voice measured and calm, the voice of a professional trying to find a rational explanation. "Sounds can travel and echo in ways that seem unnatural." Reed shook his head, his breath pluming in the cold air. "I know. I've heard it before. But this was different. It wasn't an echo. It was like the sound was coming from everywhere at once. From the walls, from the sky, from inside my own head." He fell silent, and for a moment, they just stood there. 2 small figures on the edge of the abyss, listening to the silence. And then they heard it. It was not loud, not at first. It was a single, sustained note, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate not in their ears, but in their chests. It was a sound that felt ancient, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very rock beneath their feet. Begay instinctively tensed, his hand moving to the butt of his service pistol. He swept his flashlight back and forth, its beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing. The sound continued, a single, unchanging tone that seemed to hang in the air, a thread of sound woven into the fabric of the night. He looked at Reed, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and vindication. "You hear it, right?" the geologist whispered, his voice trembling. Big A didn't answer. He was a police officer, trained to observe and report. But he was also a man, and every instinct he had was screaming that something was profoundly wrong. The hum was not a sound of this world. It was a sound from a place he did not know, a place he did not want to know. The single, haunting hum did not fade. Instead, it began to change, to shift and morph in ways that defied Big A's understanding of acoustics. It seemed to split, to fracture into a dozen different tones, each one clear and distinct, yet all woven together into a complex, layered tapestry of sound. Then, voices emerged from the hum, not one, but many. They were chanting in a language that Big A, a fluent Navajo speaker, did not recognize. The words were familiar, the cadences similar to the ceremonial songs he had heard since childhood. But the arrangement was wrong, the grammar twisted into something alien and unsettling. It was as if someone had learned the language from a book and was now trying to recreate its music without understanding its soul. The most terrifying aspect was the movement of the sound. It did not echo in the way a normal sound would. It did not bounce off the canyon walls in a predictable pattern. Instead, it seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. One moment, a deep, resonant male voice would appear to come from directly behind them, so close that Big A could feel the air vibrate against his neck. He would spin around, flashlight raised, but there would be nothing but empty space and the dark, silent desert. The next moment, a chorus of higher-pitched voices, female or perhaps children, would seem to emanate from the canyon floor hundreds of feet below them. He would shine his light down, but the beam would be swallowed by the darkness, revealing nothing but the sheer, impassive rock. The chanting grew in intensity, a rising and falling tide of sound that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. It was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. The harmonies were perfect, complex, and otherworldly, yet they conveyed a sense of profound sadness, a grief so old and deep it felt like a physical weight. Big A found himself frozen, his training forgotten, his mind struggling to process the impossible reality of what he was hearing. He was aware of Dr. Reed beside him, fumbling with his phone, trying to record the phenomenon. "It's not working," Reed whispered, his voice choked with disbelief. "It's just picking up static." Big A tried his own radio, keying the microphone. "Dispatch, Unit 14, can you read me?" All he got back was a burst of static, a hiss that was strangely, unnaturally, in harmony with the chanting. The sound began to coalesce, to focus. It felt like it was drawing in on them, closing in from all directions. The individual voices became clearer, more distinct. Big A could hear words now, snippets of a language that was almost Navajo, but not quite. Words about shadows, about the cold between the stars, about a hunger that could never be satisfied. The air grew colder still, an unnatural biting cold that seemed to leach the warmth from their bodies. Big A could see his breath pluming in front of his face, thick and white. The chanting reached a crescendo, a deafening, all-encompassing wave of sound that seemed to press in on them from all sides. It was no longer just a sound. It was a physical force, a presence that filled the air, the rock, the very space between atoms. Big A felt a cold dread wash over him, a primal fear that had nothing to do with rational thought. He was no longer an officer of the law investigating a strange report. He was a witness to something that had no name, no explanation, and no mercy. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was a presence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that fell over the canyon, so complete and absolute that it felt like a physical blow. Begay's ears rang with the ghost of the chanting, a phantom echo that played tricks on his mind. The sudden void was more terrifying than the sound had been. The chanting, for all its horror, had been a thing of life, of energy, of purpose. The silence was empty, dead, and final. It was the silence of a world that had ended. For a long moment, neither Biggie nor Reed moved. They stood frozen at the edge of the canyon, their flashlights cutting nervous, trembling beams into the darkness. The cold was still there, a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. Bigay slowly lowered his hand from his weapon, his fingers stiff and unresponsive. He looked at Reed, whose face was a mask of pale shock in the dim light. The geologist's phone lay on the ground at his feet, forgotten. What was that? Reed finally managed to stammer, his voice a hoarse whisper. Bigay shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. He had no answer. He had no frame of reference, no category in his mind for what they had just experienced. He forced himself to move, to break the spell of the silence. He keyed his radio again, the click of the button unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Dispatch, Unit 14. Do you copy?" This time, the response was immediate. The dispatcher's voice a welcome anchor to reality. "Loud and clear, Unit 14. We lost you for a bit there. Everything okay?" Bigay took a deep breath, the cold air searing his lungs. "Negative, dispatch. I need you to send 2 additional units to my location, Canyon de Chelly, Spider Rock Overlook, and I need you to contact the Historic Preservation Department. I need a cultural advisor, as soon as possible." There was a pause on the other end, the dispatcher processing the unusual request. "Copy that. Unit 14, en route." As he waited for backup, Bigay conducted a slow, methodical search of the immediate area. He walked the perimeter of the clearing, his flashlight beam sweeping the ground, the canyon walls, the sky. He found nothing. No footprints other than their own. No signs of recent human presence. No equipment that could have produced the sound. The ground was hard and dry, perfect for tracking, but there were no tracks to be found. It was as if the chanting had been performed by ghosts, by entities that left no trace of their passage. He walked back to the edge of the canyon and peered down into the darkness. The silence remained, absolute and unbroken. But as he stood there listening, he thought he could feel something else. A faint, residual vibration in the soles of his boots. A low, almost imperceptible thrumming that seemed to come from the heart of the earth itself. It was a feeling that would stay with him for the rest of his life. A constant reminder of the night the canyon sang its terrible, beautiful song. The first backup unit arrived 20 minutes later, followed by the second 10 minutes after that. Officers Benali and Yazzie, both younger than Bigay but experienced patrolmen, stepped out of their vehicles, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Tom, what's going on?" Benali asked, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Dispatch said you needed a cultural advisor." Bigay simply gestured toward the canyon rim. "Just listen." The 3 officers stood in silence for a long moment. The only sounds were the wind whispering through the junipers and the distant call of a lone nighthawk. "Listen to what, Tom?" Yazzie finally asked. Bigay knew how it sounded. He knew how impossible it was to describe. "You had to be here," he said, his voice quiet. "Something happened. Something I can't explain." When the cultural advisor, a soft-spoken elder named Samuel Hosteen, arrived an hour later, Begay recounted the event in detail, leaving nothing out. He described the sound, the impossible acoustics, the bone-deep cold, the words he couldn't quite understand. Hosteen listened patiently, his face impassive, his eyes dark and deep. When Begay was finished, the elder walked to the edge of the canyon and stood in silence for a long time, his gaze fixed on the towering shape of Spider Rock. He did not ask for proof or express disbelief. He simply stood there, as if listening to a story the rock was telling him. Finally, he turned back to the officers. "There are places," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "where the veil between worlds is thin. This canyon is one of them. You have heard the echoes of a place that is not this place. You have heard the songs of the people who live in the shadows." The official documentation of the event began at dawn. The three officers, accompanied by Dr. Reed and Samuel Hosteen, conducted a thorough search of the area. They used grid patterns, they photographed the ground, they examined the canyon walls with binoculars. They found nothing. The incident report, filed later that day as Case 12-10-884, was a study in careful, professional language. Begay wrote, "At approximately 01:30 hours, this officer responded to a report of unusual auditory phenomena. Upon arrival, this officer and witness, Dr. Michael Reed, observed a complex choral performance, seemingly in the Navajo language, exhibiting acoustic properties inconsistent with the natural environment of the canyon. He noted the sudden drop in temperature, the failure of electronic recording equipment, and the radio interference. He attached a statement from Dr. Reed and a cultural observation from Samuel Hosteen. The investigation did not end there. Dr. Reed, determined to find a scientific explanation, sent the audio file from his phone to an acoustics lab at Northern Arizona University. The lab's report, which arrived 2 weeks later, was baffling. The file contained nothing but static, but a spectral analysis of the static revealed patterns that were, in the words of the lead researcher, mathematically complex and organized in ways that suggest artificial origin. But we have no known mechanism that could produce such a signal." The report concluded with a single, stark sentence. "The source of this phenomenon is unidentifiable with current acoustic science." Begay filed the report away, a permanent and unsettling entry in the official record of the Navajo Tribal Police. He had done his job. He had documented the impossible. But the documentation brought no answers, only more questions. In the weeks and months that followed, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. The incident at Spider Rock became a quiet legend, a story whispered among the officers at the Chinle substation, but never discussed in official settings. Dr. Reed packed up his camp and left the canyon, ending his research project early. He sent Begay a brief email thanking him for his professionalism, but they never spoke again. The cultural advisor, Samuel Hosteen, performed a small blessing ceremony at the overlook, a quiet ritual to restore balance to a place that had been disturbed. For the outside world, nothing had happened. The official report remained buried in a file cabinet, a testament to an event without explanation. But for Officer Thomas Begay, nothing was the same. The silence of the desert night, once a source of comfort and solitude, now held a new and unsettling resonance. He found himself listening more closely on his patrols, not just for the sounds of trouble, but for the echoes of something else. He would often stop his patrol car at the edge of a canyon or a vast, empty plain and turn off the engine just to sit in the darkness and listen. He never heard the chanting again, but he never forgot it. The sound was now a part of him, a memory etched into his consciousness as deeply as the ancient petroglyphs were etched into the canyon walls. He became more attuned to the subtle energies of the land, the way the air would sometimes feel heavy with presence, the way the silence would sometimes feel like it was holding its breath. He began to understand, in a way he never had before, the stories his grandfather had told him as a boy. Stories of the holy people, of the beings that lived in the canyons and the mountains, of the thin places where the worlds touched. He had always treated those stories as folklore, as metaphors for the forces of nature. Now, he wasn't so sure. He had stood at the edge of the abyss and heard the songs from the other side. He continued his patrols, a quiet, professional presence in a world that was far more mysterious than most people could imagine. He filed his reports, he responded to his calls, he served his community with the same dedication he always had. But he carried the experience with him, a secret knowledge that set him apart. He had looked into the heart of the unknown, and the unknown had looked back. He had documented the impossible, and in doing so, had been forced to accept that there were things in this world that were beyond his power to explain, to control, or to forget. The canyon had fallen silent again. But for Thomas Begay, the echo would never fade. No trace was ever found of the source of the chanting, though he would often stand at the canyon rim on later shifts, listening to a silence that was no longer empty. 300 miles northwest, in the remote community of Kayenta, Officer Lorraine Benally was beginning her third consecutive night shift. The winter of 2017 had been particularly harsh, even by the standards of the high desert. A series of powerful storms had swept down from the Rockies, dumping feet of snow on the reservation and transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of white and gray. The roads, already treacherous in their isolation, had become nearly impassable ribbons of ice, flanked by drifts that rose higher than a man's head. For the Navajo tribal police, this meant patrols were slower, more dangerous, and often conducted in a state of profound isolation, where a breakdown could mean a life-threatening wait for assistance in the bitter cold. Benally, at 31, was still relatively new to the force, but she had quickly earned a reputation for resilience and level-headedness. She had grown up in the small community of Shantou, and she understood the winter's fury as well as anyone. She knew the tricks of the roads, the places where black ice formed in the shadows of the mesas, the signs of an impending whiteout. Her patrol car, a four-wheel drive SUV, was her lifeline, and she treated it with a mechanic's care, checking the tire chains, the fluid levels, and the emergency survival kit in the trunk before every shift. The substation in Kayenta was quiet that night, the low hum of the furnace a constant companion to the crackle of the radio. The dispatcher, a veteran named Earl, was nursing a cup of coffee and watching the weather radar, which showed another band of snow moving in from the west. The first few hours of Benally's shift were a testament to the challenges of winter policing. She responded to a report of a power outage in a small housing cluster, spending an hour there helping an elderly couple light their propane lamps and ensuring their small heater was working safely. She then assisted a stranded motorist whose car had slid into a ditch, calling for a tow and waiting with the young family until a wrecker arrived, its flashing lights painting the snow in eerie, strobing colors. Each call was a small victory against the encroaching chaos, a moment of order imposed upon the wildness of the storm. By 2 a.m., the snow had begun to fall again, a fine, crystalline powder that reduced visibility to almost nothing and created a disorienting, whiteout effect. It was at 2:47 a.m. that the call came in, relayed to them by the Utah Highway Patrol. A long-haul trucker, a man named Robert Martinez, was reporting an abandoned vehicle on Highway 163, approximately 15 miles north of the Arizona-Utah border. The connection was poor, Martinez's voice breaking up with static, but the details he provided were chilling. He had seen the car's headlights ahead of him, and then, suddenly, they had gone dark. As he passed the vehicle, he saw what appeared to be a person, a woman, standing outside the car. He had slowed, intending to offer assistance, but as he watched, she had simply walked away from the vehicle and disappeared into the swirling snow. He hadn't seen her fall or get into another car. She had just vanished. Benally was the closest unit, but she knew the journey would be a brutal one. The dispatcher plotted her route, a 30-mile stretch of highway that was currently under a severe weather advisory. "Be careful out there, Lorraine." Earl's voice crackled over the radio. "Road conditions are reported as treacherous. Plows haven't been through that section since the storm started." Benally acknowledged the transmission, her voice calm and professional, though she felt a knot of tension tighten in her stomach. She checked her gear, making sure her flashlight, radio, and sidearm were secure, and pulled out of the substation parking lot, the SUV's headlights cutting a weak, yellow cone through the blinding snow. The drive was a harrowing exercise in concentration. The highway was barely visible, a ghostly suggestion beneath a thick blanket of white. The SUV's wipers worked furiously, but they could barely keep up with the relentless fall of snow. Benally drove at a crawl, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the road for any sign of danger. The world outside the windshield had dissolved into a uniform, featureless void. There were no landmarks, no other cars, no signs of life. It was as if she were driving through a void, a liminal space between worlds. The only sounds were the hum of the engine, the swish of the tires through the snow, and the occasional urgent crackle of the radio. She felt profoundly alone, a tiny bubble of warmth and light in an ocean of cold, indifferent white. After what felt like an eternity, she saw it, a faint, dark shape ahead of her, partially obscured by a snowdrift. As she drew closer, she could see it was a sedan, a late-model vehicle that was already half buried by the storm. It was parked on the shoulder of the road, its engine off, its lights extinguished. The driver's side door stood slightly ajar, a dark, gaping hole in the side of the car. Benally pulled over behind it, leaving her engine running and her emergency lights flashing, a beacon in the suffocating darkness. She took a deep breath, the air inside the cab suddenly feeling thick and heavy. She stepped out of the SUV, the cold of physical shock, 1,000 needles piercing her skin. The world was unnervingly silent. The snow seemed to muffle all sound, creating a profound, almost deafening quiet. Benally approached the vehicle cautiously, her hand resting on the grip of her pistol. The snow around the car was undisturbed, a pristine, smooth surface that showed no signs of footprints or tracks. This was the first thing that struck her as wrong. The trucker had reported seeing a woman walk away from the car, but there were no footprints leading from the open door into the storm. It was as if she had simply materialized at the car, then dematerialized again. Benally peered inside the vehicle. The interior was cold and still. On the passenger seat sat a purse, its contents neatly organized. Benally used a gloved hand to open it and found a wallet inside. The driver's license identified the owner as Sarah Mitchell, a 32-year-old woman from Page, Arizona. The photo showed a smiling woman with dark hair and kind eyes. Benally radioed dispatch with the information, her voice sounding small and distant in the vast emptiness. "Dispatch, Unit 7. I have located the vehicle. It's a late-model Toyota Camry, registered to a Sarah Mitchell of Page, Arizona. The vehicle is abandoned, driver's side door open. No sign of the driver. Repeat, no sign of the driver. She conducted a thorough search of the immediate area, her flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the falling snow. She found nothing. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, no evidence that anyone had been in the vicinity other than herself. The car itself was in perfect working order. The gas tank was 3/4 full, the tires were in good condition, and a quick inspection revealed no mechanical issues that would explain why the driver might have abandoned it. The scene made no sense. It was a puzzle with missing pieces, a story that had stopped in mid-sentence. The open door, the undisturbed snow, the missing woman, it was a tableau of impossibility. Backup arrived at 3:45 a.m. 2 officers in a heavy-duty patrol truck that had no trouble navigating the snow-covered road. Together, they established a perimeter and conducted a more extensive search, using powerful spotlights to scan the desert on both sides of the highway. They found nothing. The snow continued to fall, obliterating any potential tracks that might have existed earlier, erasing the story as quickly as it had been written. A helicopter search was impossible due to the weather, and ground teams were hampered by the deteriorating conditions. As dawn approached, the decision was made to suspend the search until daylight and a break in the weather. The abandoned sedan was towed to the Kayenta substation, where it was processed for evidence. The investigation that followed would only deepen the mystery. Sarah Mitchell was identified as a social worker who had been traveling to a conference in Salt Lake City. Her husband, when contacted, confirmed that she had left Page the previous afternoon and had planned to drive straight through, stopping only for coffee. He had last spoken to her at 9:30 p.m., when she had called to tell him she was on the outskirts of Kayenta and was going to stop for a quick break before continuing north. Surveillance footage from the 2 convenience stores in Kayenta showed no sign of her or her vehicle, though the timestamp system on one of the cameras had been malfunctioning that night. 3 days after the abandoned vehicle was discovered, the case took an even stranger turn. Sarah Mitchell's husband called the tribal police, his voice frantic and filled with a desperate hope. He told them that he had received a call from his wife's phone. The number, however, had appeared as a string of random, unrecognizable digits. He had answered and had heard his wife's voice on the other end. It sounded distant, he said, as if she were speaking from a great distance or through a thick wall. She sounded confused, disoriented. She had only said a few words. "I'm sorry," she had said, her voice thin and wavering. "I have to go with them. They're waiting." Then the line had gone dead. Cell phone records could not verify the call. The number was not in service, and there was no record of a connection being made to her husband's phone at that time. It was as if the call had never happened, a phantom message from a ghost. But her husband was adamant. He had heard her voice. He knew it was her. Tribal police conducted extensive searches throughout the spring and summer, following up on every lead, every reported sighting. They found nothing. It was as if Sarah Mitchell had been erased from the face of the earth. The case remains active in the Navajo Tribal Police database as a missing person investigation. But it is one that is haunted by unexplained elements, by a lack of evidence that is as telling as any clue. The empty vehicle, the undisturbed snow, the impossible phone call, they are all pieces of a mystery that defies logic. A story that ends not with an answer, but with a profound and chilling silence. No trace of Sarah Mitchell was ever found. In the spring of 2019, the high desert of the Navajo Nation was in the midst of its brief, glorious awakening. The winter snows had melted, feeding the arroyos and coaxing a vibrant green carpet of grass and wildflowers from the thirsty soil. The air was filled with the buzz of insects and the cheerful chirping of birds that had returned from their southern migrations. It was a season of renewal, of life pushing its way through the cracks of the harsh landscape. For Officer Daniel Yazzie, it was a season of new beginnings as well. He had just transferred from the Flagstaff Police Department to the Navajo Tribal Police Station in Window Rock, eager to serve the community where his grandparents had been born and where he still had family. At 28, Yazzie was the youngest officer at the substation, a fact that made him both eager to prove himself and slightly intimidated by the seasoned veterans he now worked alongside. He had been a competent officer in Flagstaff, but policing the reservation was a different world. It was less about responding to calls and more about being a part of the community, about understanding the intricate web of relationships, traditions, and unspoken rules that governed life here. His adjustment was a daily learning process, a constant effort to balance his modern law enforcement training with a deep respect for the ancient culture that permeated every aspect of life on the reservation. He spent his days learning the back roads, practicing his Navajo with the elders at the local chapter house, and listening to the stories his colleagues told, tales that often straddled the line between folklore and fact. It was on a Tuesday night, just 3 months into his new assignment, that he received a call that would challenge his understanding of reality in ways he had never anticipated. The call came in at 1:13 a.m., the dispatcher's voice calm but with an undercurrent of concern. The caller was Esther Tso, an elderly woman who lived alone in a traditional hogan about 12 miles southeast of Window Rock. She was reporting a prowler, someone watching her through her window. But as the dispatcher listened, it became clear that this was not a typical break-in. Mrs. Tso was insistent, her voice trembling with a fear that went beyond the ordinary. The person she saw looking in her window, she said, was not a stranger. It was her own face. Yazzie was the closest unit, and he accepted the call with a professional copy dispatch. As he drove south on Indian Route 12, the night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and sage. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light, and the world was a landscape of deep shadows and silvery highlights. He tried to prepare himself for what he might find. A prowler was a standard police call, but the details were strange. He considered the possibilities. Was Mrs. Tso confused? Was she suffering from some kind of medical episode, a hallucination brought on by medication or dementia? He made a mental note to request an EMT unit to stage nearby, just in case. The drive to the hogan took him deeper into the countryside, away from the lights of Window Rock and into a world of profound silence and isolation. The road was a winding strip of pavement that cut through a landscape of rolling hills and juniper-dotted mesas. He passed a few scattered homes, their windows dark and silent, but for the most part, he was alone. The GPS on his dashboard computer guided him to the location, a small turnoff that led to a cluster of buildings silhouetted against the starry sky. As he approached, he could see a single light burning in one of the structures, a warm, yellow glow that looked like a beacon in the darkness. He parked his patrol car and approached the hogan, announcing his presence in a loud, clear voice. "Navajo Tribal Police, is anyone home?" The door to the hogan opened, and a small, elderly woman stood there, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. This was Esther Tso. She was wrapped in a thick blanket, and she clutched it tightly around her shoulders. "Officer," she said, her voice a thin whisper. "Thank you for coming. Please, come inside. It's still out there." Inside, the hogan was warm and cozy, a single room filled with the smell of wood smoke and herbs. A small fire burned in a central stove, its light dancing on the log walls. Yazzie could see that Mrs. Tso was lucid and coherent. Her eyes were clear, and her speech, though frightened, was rational. She offered him a cup of tea, which he politely declined. And then she began to tell him what had happened. She had been sitting by the fire, reading a book, when she had felt a sudden chill, a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. She had looked up and had seen a face looking in at her through the small, circular window on the east side of the hogan. At first, she had thought it was a reflection. But as she stared, she realized with a dawning horror that it was not her reflection. It was another face, identical to her own in every detail. It had the same wrinkles, the same gray-streaked hair pulled back in a bun, the same small silver bracelet on its left wrist that she herself was wearing. The face had simply stared at her, its expression blank, its eyes unblinking. It had not moved or spoken. It had just watched her. Mrs. Tissot had been paralyzed with fear, unable to scream or move. She had stared back at the doppelganger for what felt like an eternity, though she estimated it was probably only 30 seconds. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it had vanished, fading into the darkness outside as if it had never been there. Yazzie listened patiently, his professional demeanor masking a growing sense of unease. He was a man of science and logic, a product of modern law enforcement training. He didn't believe in ghosts or doppelgangers. But there was a sincerity in Mrs. Tissot's voice, a raw terror that was impossible to fake. He thanked her for her story and then stepped outside to investigate. He walked the perimeter of the hogan, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The ground was dry and hard, and it would have clearly shown any footprints. But there were none. The only tracks in the dirt were his own. He examined the window. It was small, perhaps 18 inches in diameter, and set high in the wall. To look through it, someone would have to be at least 6 feet tall, and they would have to stand on something. But there was nothing nearby that could have served as a step. The ground beneath the window was undisturbed, covered with the same hard-packed dirt as the rest of the yard. There were no signs of a ladder having been leaned against the wall, no scuff marks on the log siding. It was physically impossible for someone to have stood there and looked in the window. Yazzie radioed dispatch to report his findings and to request a cultural advisor. He knew that this was a situation that went beyond his training, a problem that required a different kind of expertise. Within 30 minutes, Officer Raymond Biguet, a 20-year veteran of the force and a respected medicine man, arrived at the scene. Biguet was a calm, dignified man with a deep knowledge of Navajo traditions and beliefs. He spoke with Mrs. Tissot in Navajo for nearly an hour, his voice low and soothing. Then he conducted a small ceremony outside the hogan, burning sage and chanting quietly as he walked around the structure. When he finished, he explained to Yazzie that what Mrs. Tissot had experienced was consistent with accounts of what some traditions call dark mirror spirits or shadow walkers. These were not the spirits of the dead, he explained, but something else, entirely malevolent entities that could take the appearance of living people and were often associated with certain locations or family lines. They were drawn to places of power, to places where the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin. They were harbingers of misfortune, and their appearance was a grave warning. Mrs. Tissot was relocated to stay with relatives in Fort Defiance that night, and officers checked on her regularly over the following weeks. She reported no further encounters, though she refused to return to her hogan. The building was eventually blessed and ceremonially closed by tribal elders, a process designed to contain any negative energy and restore balance to the place. The official incident report, filed as Case 19-04-527, classified the event as unexplained visual phenomenon and included detailed cultural notes from Officer Biguet. Yazzie would later tell colleagues that the experience fundamentally changed his understanding of what was possible in the vast desert night. He had come to the reservation to serve his community, but he had learned a lesson that went far beyond the scope of his police training. He had learned that some things could not be explained by logic or science, that some mysteries were rooted in a world that was just as real and just as dangerous as the one he had sworn to protect and serve. The window watcher was never seen again, but its image was burned into Daniel Yazzie's memory, a chilling reminder of the thin veil between the seen and the unseen. The summer of 2020 was a season of fear and uncertainty across the Navajo Nation. The COVID-19 pandemic had swept through the reservation with devastating force, its impact amplified by generations of systemic neglect and a lack of adequate healthcare infrastructure. The virus was an invisible, relentless enemy, and the community was locked down in a state of siege. For the Navajo tribal police, this meant adapting to a new and dangerous reality. Patrols were conducted with masks and gloves, interactions with the public were kept to a minimum, and the very air they breathed seemed to carry the threat of infection. The weight of the crisis was felt most acutely in the dispatch centers, the nerve centers of the emergency response system, where a small team of dedicated men and women worked around the clock, processing a constant stream of calls for help, medical emergencies, and the general anxiety of a community under siege. Among the dispatchers was Maria Charlie, a 43-year-old mother of 3 who had worked in communications for 11 years. She was known for her calm demeanor during emergencies, her encyclopedic knowledge of reservation geography and residents, and her ability to soothe a frantic caller with a few quiet, reassuring words. Her job was her life's work, a service to her community that she took with the utmost seriousness. The dispatch center in Shiprock, New Mexico, was her second home. A windowless room filled with the constant glow of computer monitors, the low hum of servers, and the never-ending crackle of radios. It was a high-stress environment, but Maria thrived on it, finding a sense of purpose in the chaos, a way to bring order to the unpredictable. On the night of August 17th, Maria was working the graveyard shift with 2 other dispatchers. The call volume was moderate, a lull in the storm that had been raging for months. A domestic disturbance in Kirtland, a traffic accident near Farmington, a request for a welfare check on an elderly man in Nageezi. Maria handled each call with her usual efficiency and compassion, her voice a steady, calming presence in the ear of people in crisis. The hours ticked by, the room a small island of controlled light in the vast darkness of the reservation. Everything was proceeding according to protocol, a predictable rhythm of calls and responses. It was the kind of night that could lull a person into a false sense of security, a belief that the world, for all its troubles, was still a place that operated according to a set of understandable rules. That illusion was shattered at 3:22 a.m. The call came in on the non-emergency line, a rare occurrence for that time of night. Maria answered it with a standard greeting. "Navajo Tribal Police Dispatch. This is Maria." The voice on the other end was one she recognized instantly, a voice that sent a jolt of ice through her veins. It was the voice of Daniel Tso. "Maria," the voice said, calm and professional, just as she remembered it. "I need a unit. I'm at the old overlook off Highway 491, near the Arizona state line. I've found a vehicle, abandoned. Looks like there's been foul play." Maria froze, her hand hovering over the keyboard. Daniel Tso had been a respected officer with the tribal police for 15 years, a friend, a colleague. He had also been dead for 6 months, killed in a tragic off-duty vehicle accident on a rain-slicked road outside of Gallup. Maria had attended his funeral, had cried with his wife, had comforted his children. She knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the ground beneath her feet, that Daniel Tizo was dead. Thinking it must be a cruel prank or perhaps a new officer with the same name, she forced her voice to remain steady. "Can I have your badge number, please?" she asked, her heart pounding in her chest. The response was immediate and correct. "Badge number 742. It was Daniel's old badge number, a number that had not been reassigned, a number that was now just a memory in the personnel files. The caller then provided detailed directions to a location that was known only to a few of the older officers, a secluded spot that was sometimes used for surveillance. His voice was exactly as Maria remembered it, the same calm, measured cadence, the same slight hint of a New Mexico accent. There was no doubt in her mind. It was Daniel. Her supervisor, noticing her pale complexion and the look of shock on her face, came over and took over the call. While Maria stumbled out of the room and into the hallway, her mind reeling. She leaned against the cool wall, trying to catch her breath, trying to make sense of the impossible. Meanwhile, her supervisor, a gruff veteran named Frank, continued the conversation, his voice a mask of professional skepticism. "And what's your location again, officer?" he asked. The caller repeated the directions, then added a detail that sent a chill through the entire dispatch center. "The vehicle is a 2018 Chevy Silverado, stolen out of Albuquerque last week. New Mexico plates, Adam William Edward 432. There's blood on the driver's side door handle." Frank, despite his disbelief, followed protocol. He relayed the information to the two closest units, who were immediately dispatched to the location. He then contacted Human Resources to verify, yet again, that no officer named Daniel Tso was currently employed by the Navajo Tribal Police. The confirmation came back quickly, cold and definitive. Daniel Tso was deceased. The call had lasted 3 minutes and 42 seconds. When it ended, the dispatch center fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the hum of the computers and the frantic beating of their own hearts. The responding officers arrived at the secluded overlook approximately 20 minutes after the call. They found the scene exactly as the caller had described it. A stolen Chevy Silverado was parked at the edge of the overlook, its driver's side door slightly ajar. There were dark, reddish-brown smears on the door handle and the edge of the seat. The license plates matched the description given by the caller. The scene was fresh, the tire tracks in the dirt still sharp and clear. The officers conducted a thorough search of the area, but they found no sign of Daniel Tso, living or deceased. No footprints, no other vehicles, no evidence that anyone had been in the vicinity other than the person who had left the stolen truck. The stolen vehicle was processed for evidence, and the case was referred to the FBI, as it potentially involved federal crimes crossing state lines. But the mystery of the call remained. Back at the dispatch center, Maria and her supervisor reviewed the call recording. They listened to it over and over, their faces pale in the glow of the monitors. The voice was unmistakably that of Daniel Tso. The information he provided was accurate, actionable, and had led to the discovery of a potential crime scene. There was no static, no interference, no indication that the call was anything other than a routine officer requesting backup. Cell tower analysis was conducted, but the results were baffling. The call had not originated from a single cell tower. Instead, it had bounced between multiple towers across the reservation, a pattern that technicians described as impossible under normal circumstances. It was as if the call had been coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. A ghost in the machine. The incident was documented in an internal affairs report, Case 20-08913, a file that was thicker and more detailed than most. filled with statements from the dispatchers, the responding officers, and the technical experts who had analyzed the call. The story of the call spread quickly through the tight-knit law enforcement community. It was a story that defied explanation, a story that spoke to a deeper, more primal fear. Several officers who had worked closely with Daniel Tso requested transfers following the incident, citing an unease with continuing to work in an environment where such calls could occur. Maria Charlie eventually took early retirement, telling a local newspaper in an anonymous interview that some things don't fit in the boxes we create for them. The stolen vehicle case was never solved, and no connection was ever established between it and the mysterious call from the deceased officer. The call from Daniel Tso remains one of the most discussed and most disturbing events in the history of the Navajo Tribal Police Dispatch Center. A chilling reminder that sometimes the line between this world and the next is not as solid as we would like to believe. Officer James Tso had patrolled the remote western portion of the Navajo Nation for 17 years. He knew the roads, the families, the seasonal patterns of life in the high desert. He knew the land in a way that only someone who had spent a lifetime on it could. He could read the weather in the color of the sky, find water in the driest arroyo, and navigate the maze of dirt tracks and trails by memory alone. He was also a man who understood the stories, the old tales that had been passed down through generations. He knew about the witches and the shapeshifters, the malevolent beings that were said to walk the night. He didn't talk about them much, not in a professional capacity, but he respected the power of those stories. And he knew that there were places and times when it was best to be careful. It was this cultural knowledge that made the call he received on a cold October night in 2021 particularly unsettling. The fall had come early to the high desert, and the nights were already bitter cold, the wind carrying the promise of the coming winter. Tso was on patrol in the community of Sweetwater, a small cluster of homes and trailers nestled in a valley surrounded by low, scrub-covered hills. It was a quiet area, a place where not much happened, which was why Tso enjoyed his patrols there. It was a chance to escape the more intense pressures of the larger towns and to simply drive through the vast, empty landscape. A solitary figure in a world that felt ancient and unchanged. The call came in at 11:47 p.m., relayed by the dispatcher in a hushed, serious tone. The caller was a middle school teacher named Gloria Nez, and she was hysterical, her voice a high-pitched stream of terror. She was reporting strange noises outside her home and what appeared to be a large animal walking on two legs. The dispatcher, trying to calm her down, asked for more details. Gloria Nez, struggling to speak, explained that she and her 3 children had been watching television when they heard what sounded like scratching at the back door. Her 16-year-old son, David, had gone to investigate and had screamed. When Gloria ran to the kitchen, she saw through the window what appeared to be a large dog, or perhaps a wolf, standing on its hind legs. It was looking in the window, its front paws pressed against the glass. And then, she said, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper, it had spoken. It had said her name. Tso felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew the Nez family. They were good people, quiet and respectful. Gloria Nez was not the type to make things up, to invent stories for attention. And the word she had used, the word that the dispatcher had carefully noted in the call log, was a word that carried a heavy weight of fear and tradition. She had mentioned the word skinwalker. Tso keyed his microphone, his voice steady, betraying none of the unease he felt. Dispatch, Unit 12, copy. I'm en route to the Nez residence, ETA 15 minutes. Please advise the family to stay inside, lock all doors and windows, and remain quiet. He then contacted his supervisor to request backup, noting that the call involved potential cultural sensitivities. 2 additional officers agreed to meet him at the scene, though they would arrive approximately 10 minutes after his initial arrival. The drive to the Nez residence was a tense, silent journey. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the world was a landscape of deep shadows and indistinct shapes. The wind was picking up, whistling through the cracks in the patrol car's doors, a mournful, eerie sound. Tso's mind raced, sifting through the stories he had heard, the warnings he had been given as a child. He knew that encounters with skinwalkers were rare, but they were not unheard of. They were usually associated with a specific place, a family, or a person. They were not random. The fact that one had appeared at the Nez home was a deeply troubling sign. He arrived at the residence to find the house completely dark, save for a single light burning in the living room. He parked his patrol car in the driveway, its headlights cutting across the yard, and approached the front door cautiously. He could see movement inside, the silhouettes of the family huddled together. He knocked on the door, announcing his presence. The door opened a crack, and Gloria Nez's terrified face peered out. "Officer Tso?" she whispered. "It's still out there. I can hear it." Tso entered the house, his senses on high alert. The air inside was thick with fear. The 3 children were huddled on the couch, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Tso spoke with them quietly, trying to get a clear picture of what had happened. The story was consistent with what the dispatcher had relayed. They had heard scratching. Then the son had seen the creature at the back door. It was large, he said, bigger than a man, covered in dark fur. Its eyes glowed red in the porch light. And then it had spoken Gloria's name, its voice a guttural, rasping sound that was not human. After that, they had retreated to the living room and locked themselves in, listening as the creature moved around the exterior of the house, occasionally tapping on windows or scratching at doors. Tso conducted a thorough search of the property while waiting for backup. He found no footprints or other physical evidence, though the ground was dry and would have clearly shown tracks. The back door did bear several scratch marks, approximately 4 feet from the ground, consistent with something of considerable height having stood there. The marks appeared fresh, with small splinters of wood still clinging to the door frame. As he examined the marks, he heard a sound from the side of the house, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from just around the corner. He drew his weapon, his heart pounding, and slowly rounded the corner. But there was nothing there, only the wind whipping through the dry grass. When the additional officers arrived, they established a perimeter and conducted a more extensive search of the surrounding area. Using thermal imaging cameras, they scanned the desert behind the house but found no heat signatures other than those of small animals typical of the region. The search continued for nearly 2 hours, with officers checking abandoned structures and nearby arroyos, but no evidence was found to explain what the Nez family had witnessed. The scratching on the door was the only physical evidence, and it was not enough to build a case or to provide any rational explanation. The following morning, Tso returned with a cultural advisor from the Navajo Nation Historic Preservation Department. The advisor, an elder named John Begay, was a man of great wisdom and deep spiritual knowledge. He spoke with the family at length, his voice calm and reassuring. He then examined the scratch marks on the door and performed a blessing ceremony at the home, a complex ritual involving corn pollen, sacred feathers, and the chanting of ancient prayers. After the ceremony was complete, he spoke with Tso privately. He explained that the description provided by the family was consistent with traditional accounts of skinwalkers, or, Yi Naldlushi. He said that these were not simply animals or monsters, but human witches who had gained the power to transform themselves. They were driven by jealousy, greed, and a desire for power, and they were a grave danger to the community. The official incident report, filed as Case 2110-678, classified the event as unexplained disturbance and included detailed cultural notes from John Begay. Tso would later tell colleagues that while he couldn't explain what the Nez family had experienced, he had no doubt that something had frightened them profoundly. The family installed security cameras around their property, and a traditional medicine man placed protective charms at the four corners of their land. They reported no further encounters, though Gloria Nez told Tso in a follow-up call that her children refused to go outside after dark for months afterward. The case remains one of the most frequently referenced skinwalker encounters in tribal police records, a chilling reminder that in the vast, lonely nights of the Navajo Nation, there are things that move in the darkness, things that defy our understanding of the natural world. No trace of the creature was ever found, but the memory of its red, glowing eyes stayed with James Tso, a haunting image that would visit him in his dreams for years to come. The desert highways of the Navajo Nation stretch for hundreds of miles through some of the most isolated and unforgiving terrain in the United States. They are ribbons of asphalt that cut through a world of rock, sand, and sky, a place where the horizon is an unbroken line, and the silence is a physical presence. For officers patrolling these roads, encounters with stranded motorists are a common occurrence. The vast distances, the extreme temperatures, and the aging vehicles of many residents mean that breakdowns are a frequent fact of life. Requests for transportation from residents without cars are also common, and most officers, within the bounds of policy and safety, are willing to help. It was this normal context of routine assistance that made the call received by Officer Jessica Claw on a frigid January night in 2022 so deeply, profoundly unsettling. Claw had been with the tribal police for 5 years, assigned to the Crown Point district that covered over 3,000 square miles of northwestern New Mexico. At 29, she was still relatively new to the area, but she had quickly adapted to the challenges of reservation policing. She was a capable and compassionate officer, known for her patience and her willingness to go the extra mile to help someone in need. The winter of 2022 had been particularly brutal, a season of record-breaking cold and heavy snowfalls that had transformed the high desert into a frozen wasteland. The nights were the worst, the temperatures dropping well below zero, the wind creating a wind chill that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. It was a dangerous time to be stranded, and Claw was especially vigilant on her patrols, keeping an eye out for anyone who might be in trouble. At 1:13 a.m., dispatch relayed a call that had originally been made to the New Mexico State Police, who had then transferred it to the tribal police due to the location. The caller was a truck driver, a 46-year-old man named Robert Martinez from Albuquerque. He was hysterical, his voice a panicked stream of words that were difficult to understand. The dispatcher managed to piece together the story. Martinez had been driving north on Highway 371 when he had seen a young woman walking along the shoulder of the road. Given the extreme cold, 18 degrees, with a wind chill of 10 below, he had stopped to offer her a ride. She had accepted, climbed into the passenger seat, and thanked him quietly. He had driven for approximately 3 miles, making small talk, but she had remained silent, staring out the window. When he had commented on the cold and asked her if she was warm enough, he had received no response. He had turned to look at her, and the passenger seat had been empty. She had simply vanished from his moving truck. Claw was the closest unit, though the drive would take her nearly 30 minutes. As she headed west on Highway 371, The patrol car's heater struggled to keep the cabin warm, the air outside a searing cold. The road was a ribbon of ice, and she drove with extreme caution, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. She tried to prepare herself for what she might find. A prank? A misunderstanding? A driver who had fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing? She had encountered strange calls. The old boarding school stood abandoned for decades, its crumbling walls a silent testament to a painful chapter in Native American history. Located approximately 15 miles southeast of Gallup, the facility had operated from the 1920s until the early 1970s, housing Navajo children who were forcibly removed from their families and stripped of their language and culture. For the local community, the building represented trauma and loss, and most avoided it entirely. It was this history that made the call received by Officer Michael Lee on a sweltering August night in 2022 particularly disturbing. Lee had been with the tribal police for 8 years, working primarily in the eastern region of the reservation. At 10:47 p.m., dispatch relayed a call from a security company that monitored the abandoned boarding school property. The caller reported that motion sensors had been triggered in multiple buildings simultaneously, and audio sensors had picked up what sounded like children's voices. The property had been secured years earlier, following vandalism and concerns about structural safety, and no one was supposed to be there. The drive to the former boarding school took Lee through increasingly remote desert terrain. The moon was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the landscape as he approached the cluster of dilapidated buildings. When he arrived, the security guard who had made the call was waiting in his vehicle near the main gate, his face pale in the dashboard light. The guard, a 63-year-old retired teacher named Harold Wilson, explained that he had been conducting his routine patrol when the alarm system indicated movement in the dormitory building, the cafeteria, and the administrative offices all at the same time. When he checked the camera feeds, he saw nothing but static, though the audio sensors continued to pick up what sounded like children whispering and occasionally laughing. Wilson had worked as a security guard for the company for 5 years and had never experienced anything like it at this or any other property. Lee contacted dispatch to report his arrival and request backup before entering the property. The main gate had been cut, allowing vehicle access to the compound. The officer proceeded cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he approached the dormitory building first. The door stood slightly ajar, though Wilson confirmed it had been secured earlier that evening. Inside, the building was filled with debris and decay, with peeling paint, water damage, and remnants of its former purpose scattered throughout. As Lee moved through the hallway, he heard what sounded like footsteps on the floor above, followed by the distinct sound of a child's laughter. The officer called out, announcing his presence, but received no response. When he reached the second floor, he found no evidence of anyone having been there recently, though the dust on the floor showed clear footprints that appeared to be from small shoes. The phenomenon continued as Lee moved between buildings, voices whispering in Navajo, footsteps echoing down empty corridors, doors creaking open on their own. By the time backup arrived, Lee had documented similar occurrences in all 3 buildings where the alarm system had been triggered. The additional officers conducted a thorough search of the property, finding no signs of recent human presence other than the footprints in the dormitory building. The following morning, Lee returned with a team to conduct a more systematic investigation. They discovered that the audio sensors had indeed picked up sounds consistent with children's voices, though audio experts could not determine their origin or explain how they were being transmitted through the system. The footprints in the dormitory building were photographed and analyzed, with forensic specialists noting that they appeared to be from children's shoes but showed no signs of wear or deterioration despite the dusty environment. The incident report, Case 22-08752 classified the event as unexplained auditory and visual phenomena and included statements from all officers involved. Lee would later tell colleagues that while he had always been skeptical of supernatural claims, what he experienced at the abandoned boarding school challenged his understanding of what was possible. The property owner installed additional security measures following the incident, though similar reports would continue to come in periodically over the following months. The case remains one of the most frequently discussed unexplained events in the history of the Navajo Tribal Police. Officer Samantha Wilson had grown up in the shadow of the Carrizo Mountains, her family tracing its roots in the region back generations. At 35, she had served with the Navajo Tribal Police for 12 years, developing a reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail. It was these qualities that made her the logical choice to investigate the strange call that came in on a clear September night in 2023. The initial report came from a group of astronomy students from Northern Arizona University who had been camping in a remote canyon approximately 20 miles northeast of Ship Rock. At 2:18 a.m., one of the students used a satellite phone to contact the tribal police, reporting unusual lights and what appeared to be structured movement in the canyon below their campsite. The caller, a graduate student named David Chen, spoke calmly but with urgency, explaining that the phenomenon was unlike anything he had observed during years of astronomical research. Wilson was the closest unit, though the remote location would require nearly an hour of driving on unpaved roads, followed by a 30-minute hike to reach the student's campsite. As she prepared for the journey, she contacted her supervisor to request additional units and specialized equipment, including thermal imaging cameras and night vision gear. 2 officers agreed to meet her at the trailhead, bringing the necessary equipment to document whatever they might encounter. The drive took Wilson through increasingly isolated terrain, with the patrol vehicle's headlights revealing little more than the rough road ahead. When she arrived at the designated trailhead, the other officers were already there, having driven from the Ship Rock substation. Together, they reviewed a topographic map of the area and planned their approach, taking into consideration the difficult terrain and the potential safety risks of navigating the canyon at night. The hike to the students' campsite was challenging, with steep descents and loose rock that made progress slow. When they finally arrived, approximately 90 minutes after the initial call, they found the 4 students huddled around a small fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. Chen immediately pointed toward the canyon below, where Wilson could see what appeared to be a series of structured lights moving in patterns that defied natural explanation. Through night vision binoculars, Wilson observed what appeared to be 3 distinct sources of light, each moving independently but in coordination with the others. The lights changed color periodically from white to blue to red, and moved with precision that suggested intelligent control. Using the thermal imaging camera, Wilson detected heat signatures consistent with the visual observations, though the readings fluctuated in ways that didn't correspond to any known aircraft or natural phenomenon. For nearly 2 hours, Wilson and the other officers documented the phenomenon, taking photographs and video recordings while maintaining radio contact with dispatch. The students provided additional observational details, noting that the objects made no sound and moved in ways that would be impossible for conventional aircraft. At one point, one of the lights ascended rapidly, disappearing into the night sky within seconds. The remaining 2 lights continued their coordinated movements for another 30 minutes before gradually dimming and disappearing from view. Wilson and her team remained in position for another hour, scanning the canyon with thermal imaging equipment but finding no residual heat signatures or other evidence of what they had observed. The following morning, they conducted a thorough search of the canyon floor, finding no physical evidence that might explain the phenomenon. The incident report, Case 23-479, classified the event as unidentified aerial phenomena, and included detailed documentation from multiple witnesses. The photographs and video recordings were analyzed by experts at the University of New Mexico, who concluded that the objects exhibited characteristics consistent with other documented UAP encounters, but inconsistent with known aircraft, natural phenomena, or other conventional explanations. Wilson would later tell colleagues that while she couldn't explain what she had witnessed that night, the experience fundamentally changed her perspective on what might exist beyond our current understanding. The case remains one of the most thoroughly documented, unexplained events in the history of the Navajo tribal police. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, particularly across the Navajo Nation, where ancient traditions intersect with modern law enforcement. The 8 cases we've explored tonight represent only a fraction of the unexplained events documented in tribal police records incidents that challenge our understanding of reality and remind us that some mysteries persist despite our most rigorous investigations. What connects these seemingly disparate encounters is not just their occurrence within the boundaries of the Navajo Nation, but their resistance to conventional explanation. From the impossible acoustics of the canyon echo to the vanishing hitchhiker on a desert highway. From the dispatcher's call from beyond the grave to the voices of children in an abandoned boarding school. These accounts share a quality that transcends simple categorization. They exist in the space between documented fact and unexplained phenomenon, challenging officers to maintain professional standards while confronting experiences that defy logical explanation. For the men and women of the Navajo tribal police, these calls represent not just professional challenges, but personal ones that test their understanding of the world they've sworn to protect and serve. Many officers approach such encounters with a blend of skepticism and respect, acknowledging the cultural context of many unexplained phenomena while maintaining the investigative rigor required by their profession. This balance allows them to document the unexplained without attempting to force it into conventional categories. The stories we've shared tonight come from official police reports, witness statements, and documented evidence. They have been verified, cross-referenced, and archived according to standard law enforcement procedures. Yet they remain unresolved, not due to lack of investigation, but because they exist beyond the boundaries of what our current knowledge can explain. In this way, they serve as reminders that despite our technological advances and scientific understanding, the world still holds mysteries that resist our attempts to categorize and comprehend them. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. Our team reviews every submission, looking for cases that can be verified through official records and documented evidence. Your stories help us continue our exploration of the unexplained phenomena that occur across America's vast landscapes. Thank you for watching Sleepless Campfire. Until next time, stay safe out there.